but I do have notes. If anybody wants a thorough transcript of the whole day, come to me. Thanks, Steve, for inviting me to give this summary of the whole day. I just tell you who I am before we kick off. My name's Duncan Baker-Brown. I'm an architect, an academic. I'm in practice, I teach, I write, and I also call myself a climate activist. And I look out here now, and I notice the activists are in the room now, in every sense of the word. I was born 8 miles away from here in Epping Forest, a place that shouldn't exist. Epping Forest starts in Walthamstow, which is where I was born, and for 400 years provided hornbeam and oak to the shipping industry and other industries. A huge resource, a primary resource, before we were using steel, and yet it still exists. It's a biodiverse environment. Humans can live in harmony with planet Earth. When I was about 8 years old, I was walking up this meadow beyond the woodlands, thinking I was in the middle of nowhere with my mother, and then I stopped and said, "Mum, what's that?" And she said, "That's the NatWest Tower." And it's from the age of about 8 when I realized the fragility of our natural world and our relationship with it, and at the moment, what appears to be our disassociation with it. So from then on, I was clear that in whatever I wanted to do, I was going to be thinking about the environment. And I couldn't get away from how we were destroying it. First, I saw the M11 be built, and then the M25. I could literally see it from the farm, by the way, that I lived on. Passing for Bridge, which is where my grandfather proposed to my grandmother in 1919, was a rural, teeny little bridge going over a lovely little river. It's now the interchange between the M11 and the M25. In the 1980s, I was working and studying at the same time. I did my degree part-time, and I worked for lots of architects in London. And about 1988, I was working for on a project for the then chairman of British Land. We worked on his second kitchen in his house in London, and that second kitchen in 1988 cost £100,000. And I saw the waste of resources that went into that project, a project the kitchen he'd never even see. So I've been interested in how we manage resources and how humans do for a long time. And instead of going to work for Greenpeace, I thought, no, I can do it within my own industry. Because remember, we're an industry which is hugely impactful in a positive way. If you reduce your 10-meter by 10-meter concrete slab by 50 mil, you save as much carbon as someone giving up meat for a year. Now, I'm not saying don't give up meat, because that is a very impactful thing to do. But you see, our decisions can be hugely impactful. I've run out of paper to gather the stats. Just, a 78% reduction in carbon if you just reuse instead of, Anyway, so I've been lucky enough all my life to work on projects in this sector. And I used to say until a couple of years ago, that's why no one's heard of me. The first project I did as a student 30 years ago this month was the RIBA's House of the Future, which was an off-grid House of the Future. And we built it in 1994 in Milton Keynes. And we were more preoccupied with making sure it was a material store for the future. We've got everybody now using phrases like urban mining, resource mapping. This is where we need to be. We are exactly where we need to be. I worked on the Greenwich Millennium Village. My partner and I, we were barely finished as students. We were 28 years old. We were the innovation task force for the Greenwich Millennium Village for 3 or 4 years. And we visioned a remanufactory on site, which would deal with constructing the Greenwich Millennium Village as an ever-evolving material store for the future, being remade and remade with the original materials and new materials added. And we used to describe ourselves as those sort of awkward unloved relatives that you'd invite for Christmas, and that would be about it. And you'd hope they'd left again before the Queen did her speech. We were the embarrassment, not cool. Green meant poor design. It doesn't mean that anymore. That's good. We're in a different place, we're in a different room, we're all together, which is what we need to do. And I just want to really congratulate Steve Gilchrist for getting us all in the room, the activists and others, because we're all activists now, in this room now. So can you congratulate him by giving him a round of applause? And I hope this venue isn't used next year, because I hope it's not big enough. I mean, you can imagine it being a bit bigger, but it needs to be 10 times this size, and ought to be. With what we've heard today, why wouldn't you invest in your existing buildings and reuse them and deconstruct them? And as Christian Van Maren from the Excess Materials Exchange pointed out, we're focusing on steel today because we can get our heads around it. But to also think on what Roy was talking about, the stuff that gets in the way of the steel, I know people are reusing that. Because I've mixed research and teaching and practice together, I've had time every week to set aside to write. So in 2017, I published something called the Reuse Atlas, subtitled A Designer's Guide Towards a Circular Economy. And we had 1 or 2 case studies from the UK in there, really novel, unusual projects, including projects I did myself. But the majority of it came from the Netherlands. And I was asked 3 years ago to do a second edition of that book. And I haven't finished it yet, because there are so many events like this where I go and find out more case studies. So the book, I've interviewed over 85 people who quite often have 3 or 4 projects each, dealing with the deconstruction of buildings that people think can't be deconstructed because we haven't given it enough thought yet. We've never had the time. So believe you me, there isn't a building out there that cannot be deconstructed. In situ cast, reinforced concrete buildings, cut up with angle grinders into smaller buildings and reassembled. That can be done. But there's companies out there like Rota, based in Brussels, Rota DC, who are deconstructing buildings other people throw away. So this is only the first step, but you can see the value in it. People are doing this because not only it saves carbon, but it saves money. And you need everybody in this room, all types of practice, from lawyers, economists, to the design team and client to make it happen. And that's one thing that came across today again and again. We need to share knowledge. We cannot be in silos at all. We need to understand what each other really does so we can observe and make critical, constructive comments. One of my jobs or roles is I represent architects on the UK net zero carbon building standard. And I've got real problems with the net word, because we know we can't really offset as much as we need to. If we start with that intent of offsetting, we know it's not going to work. So we go into this exercise with a bit of a heavy heart. But you can see we don't need to. If we just go by the mantra of reducing the amount of stuff we consume, and what's on this t-shirt, which is 10 years old now and used to fit me, is there's no such thing as waste, just stuff in the wrong place. Okay? And that's what we need to think of it. We need to create those networks, which, by the way, are already there, to allow ourselves to swap stuff. And we need to find companies like Roy's and others who've been doing it for years, and they're now suddenly got a spotlight on them. And they're like, what? Roy's getting used to the spotlight now. But, really, he used to blink a bit. But now it's, bring it on. But there's a lot of other companies like that dealing with this stuff. So I know of companies that interrogate how our supply chain produces bricks, carpet, windows, or whatever, and are making the closed-loop version of that product because it makes sense. But also because there are architects out there, maybe in the Netherlands primarily, who are demanding it. But what's really interesting now is because of people like Steve and others, the Netherlands are coming over here. People from the Netherlands are coming over here. As you can see, Christians over here and others. Pablo from Medasa, they're over here. Why? Because we're looking like we're doing it. There's a bit of traction here. There's a bit of movement. So these are such exciting times to be here. I've got these notes here, and I knew I wouldn't look at them. Can I just say, I was so excited by the first testing, specifying, and data discussion this morning, because I've been to countless, like weekly conferences and discussions about the circular economy, and it's all up there. And I learned so much this morning as an architect that, we basically color in. It is all about data and getting the good data, and RICs need to get busy and have been busy, but we need to really value the people that have the good data and understand what they're telling us and respond to that. Design teams need to get together earlier on in a project. Design teams need to function a bit differently, and design is a different practice. If we're working with slightly wonky bits of steel, we can't apply those British standards and tolerances to that. We have to treat it like a heritage building, and we know how to do that. Interior architects, the whole design team know how to do that. We know how to work with wonky stuff. So we need a design approach, which might even mean an interesting new design aesthetic that responds to this new challenge. We can't keep banging our heads against a brick wall with some idea of modernism from 100 years ago when we're reworking the Anthropocene. We've got to mine the Anthropocene. We've got to rework the stuff that's already been produced. Now, with the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard coming out in January, and with even the Conservative government and its MPs and ministers trying to get their heads around whole life carbon, that's going to be a thing. Building regulations are going to be incorporating that very soon. Legislation is going to be incorporating and valuing that very soon. So if you're in the world of reuse, you know how you're going to save your carbon. You can start with steel, but everything else will follow. So I would also like to say well done to structural engineers in the UK, because from my point of view, having interviewed, like I said, over 80 people in the last 18 months, in the UK, they're leading the way. They're inspiring my practice, architecture. And there's a huge opportunity for the rest of the design team, especially, I would say, surveyors. We need to measure this stuff. We need to do deep investigative surveys into the existing built environment. And there are people doing it. There are consultants out there that have measured the resource potential of whole cities, London including. You can find the data if you want it. But it's going to take everybody working together. And we need to raise the ambition, because that door is there for pushing open. And we need to be flexible. And that's just about all I'm going to say, apart from what's stopping you. Okay? I am going to ask one more thing. Could you put your hand up if you're involved in a project that is really using reuse? Put your hand up. Can you put your hand up higher? Okay. Could you keep your hand up if you're an architect? I rest my case. Before I go, I'd just like to say thank you again for listening to me. I didn't really need to write notes. And it's over to Steve, our host for the day. He's got a couple of thank yous himself to say, but yes, thank you very much for listening to me.